Yeah.
Could we begin? Because it's almost 11.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll begin. Otherwise, we'll be wasting time.
People will join later.
Join, yes.
And in the time, little. But
good day to all of you. And on behalf of the rector and management of St. Xavier's College, the Heras Institute welcomes all of you to this session of conversation with historians. And this morning's conversation is going to be between Professor Kanchana Mahadevan, who's going to converse with Professor Vinay Lal. A little about Professor Kanchana. Professor Kanchana is very well known as the professor and head of the Department of Philosophy, University of Bombay or Mumbai. She teaches and researches in areas of feminist philosophy, decolonization, critical theory, and political thought. Professor works in interdisciplinary areas such as aesthetics and film to explore methodological perspectives. Professor Kanchana has also published in these areas in journals and anthologies, both nationally and internationally. At the moment, her book, Between Femininity and Feminism, Colonial and Post-Colonial Perspective on Care, examines the relevance of Western feminist philosophy in the Indian context. Professor Kanchana is currently researching on relationship between the secular and post-secular in the context of gender. Now I welcome all of you and I ask Professor Kanchana to carry on with the proceedings of this session. Thank you, Professor Kanchana, for accepting our invitation, and Professor Vinay Lal also for agreeing to share your expertise with all of us today. You could begin. Professor Kanchana.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Joan Dias, for inviting me to be a part of this very interesting discussion today, which has, for me, a great bearing on the discipline of philosophy as well. And I thank Professor Arvind Ganachari as well as Ms. Shilpa Chedda and everyone who has worked behind the scenes for all that they've done to make this happen. I'm privileged to introduce Professor Vinay Lal, a writer, blogger. He is a cultural critic as well as a professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has written and continues to write extensively on Indian history, diaspora, colonialism, nonviolence, Gandhi, American politics, cultures of sexuality, cinema, city, global politics of knowledge. And his work on global politics of knowledge systems impacts philosophy, in my opinion, in a major way, because there is a whole big debate in philosophy on universalism and relativism. And this is where we have much to learn from his work. His 18 books include a 2-volume anthology on the modern Indian city, the Oxford Anthology, The Future of Knowledge and Culture, a dictionary for the 21st century. He has also written on cricket, Guinness, and Gandhi, The History of History, which is a reflective exercise engaging with the discipline of history itself, which is very similar to the kind of work we do in philosophy of history, and The Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Plurality in the Global Economy. He has also written on the COVID-19, which we have all read, The Fury of COVID-19, with the philosophy students at least have read this work, The Passions, Histories, and Unrecruited Love of the Coronavirus. And his new book that has just come out is on colonialism and forms of knowledge, the British in India. I look forward to reading this. And we also anticipate 2 volumes of his papers on Gandhi. He is a blogger. He blogs at vinaylal.wordpress.com. And he also has a YouTube channel. at youtube.com user Dilli Chalo, with several lectures that are already been uploaded. Welcome, Professor Lal, to this conversation on your work on history. We thank you for accepting this invitation, and we look forward to this discussion. Can I just begin then by, can I start this off then?
Yes, please begin, Professor Kanchana.
Okay. So, Professor Lal, as I said, the interesting aspect for me as a philosopher, a student of philosophy, about the work you do is the relationship it has with philosophy, because I find your work reflexive. You're thinking about the very nature of the discipline of history in the course of articulating how history is not necessarily cut off or separated from other disciplines, but that there is something very interdisciplinary about history itself. So in your work on Much Ado About Nothing, you have pointed out that world history has its own political economy. And can you tell us a little bit about this political economy that has led to the West being the center, as it were, of the world history, and how the figure of Jawaharlal Nehru's glimpses of history, particularly his work, his figure in the sense of his work, the glimpses of history, offers another way of thinking about this. So how does the notion of pluralism enter in the notion of world history that Nehru has, which is perhaps not there in Oswald Spengler?
All right. Thank you very much, Kanchana, for the questions. But before I proceed to answer them, please allow me to thank St. Xavier's College for this very kind invitation. I'd like to thank Dr. Joan Diaz for her invitation. And I'd like to, of course, thank Kanchana, who has engaged with me and my work for many years. And it's been a real pleasure being able to actually converse with her about matters of mutual interest to both of us. So with regards to your, excuse me, with regards to your questions, I mean, they're basically a couple of questions there. One has to do with what do we really mean when we talk about world history, and what do I mean when I talk about the political economy of world history, and who writes world histories, and what do we mean, in fact, actually, when we really talk about world history? What are some of the perils of doing world history? I think all of that is really contained in your question. So that's a very long, one could give a very long answer to that, but I'll try to be very concise. And in answering that question, I will touch upon a work which I use in my course on contemporary world history. You know, at the moment, I'm actually teaching this course called Contemporary World History. And this is a course for undergraduates at UCLA. And I suspect that unlike anyone who has taught that course here before, and I suspect unlike actually almost anyone who teaches it elsewhere in the US, one of the books I do use, I don't have them read the book in its entirety, I just have them read excerpts, is Nehru's book, Glimpses of World History. And I'll begin with that very briefly, because this book itself is actually a compilation of letters that Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to his daughter Indira when she was a young girl. And I have to say, just as a little, little anecdote here, that when I had a daughter, I dreamed that I would be in the situation of being able to write similar letters to her. But fortunately, or alas, depending on how you look at it, we were never separated in her teens. So I really didn't have occasion to write those letters. because I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to be able to write letters of the sort that Jawaharlal Nehru wrote to his daughter, because he was, after all, a very cultured and educated person, and a person of a certain kind of disposition. I think he had a certain kind of attachment to history as well. Now, I use that volume partly because without being a formal history, it has the sweep of a work of history. And it's very charming in ways that one cannot really say of any sort of formal work of world history, because he'll be talking to, he'll be writing a letter to Indira, and then he'll say, my dear daughter, it so happens to be the case that I now realize that even in my previous letter, I wrote about China, and now I'm writing to you about China once again. And I don't want you to think that China is the center of the world, right? Or if he's written 4 consecutive letters about Europe, he says, I don't want you to think that somehow Europe is far more important than India or Africa. All right. Now, I'll return to this later on. Let me move to the other aspect of this question. See, who has the privilege of writing world history? Not everyone can write a world history. It's not simply because not everyone commands the facts, but that's what I mean by a political economy, that world histories come out of Paris, New York, Berlin, London, Los Angeles. They do not come out of Dhaka. They do not come out of Congo or Khartoum in Sudan, right? Or really even out of Delhi. When's the last time that any Indian actually wrote a world history? There is a political economy of world history. That means that we have to think about, what kind of publishers take up such an enterprise, who has a privilege, who has access to the kinds of libraries you would have needed. And incidentally, one of the most extraordinary things about Nehru's glimpses of world history, about the letters that he wrote, is that many of these letters, the vast majority of them were written by Nehru when he was in jail. This is, of course, during the time when India was under colonial rule. And frankly, he didn't have access to any books. I mean, large portions of this is actually really written more or less really from a few scribbled notes and from memory, which is in fact how he wrote a good deal of his works. Now, so when I'm talking about the political economy of world history, I mean, in the first instance, the particular circumstances, the sociological, historical circumstances under which people generate such histories. But of course, this also has a psychological element, because you see, one needs to have the confidence to write world histories. Now, most of us who have come out of India or come out of Africa or come out of Latin America, we were colonized people. Colonized people, I think it takes generations to actually lift that burden of colonialism. We don't really have the confidence for it. It's not that we don't have the intellectual capacity for it, but we don't really have the confidence for it, because then one gets to philosophical questions such as, how does one center a world history? Should one center it at all? Should one actually adopt a strategy of multiple ways of centering a world history? How is a narrative to be shaped? Now, of course, the question of how a narrative is to be shaped arises no matter what kind of history you write. But I think in the case of world history, it becomes far more complicated, because then we have to assess questions of temporality, we have to address questions of spatiality, we have to address questions of the interrelationship between temporality and spatiality in very different ways. And it seems to me that this is the sort of thing that was, the way for it was already being paved in the 17th century when the Europeans went out to explore the world and conquer it. And it is no accident that the colonization of these countries was accompanied by texts. Right? This is partly what Said was talking about, because what, after all, is Orientalism? Orientalism is if I had to put it in the simplest terms, Orientalism does the intellectual work of colonialism. So a vast body of knowledge was going to be created. And you can see, by the way, in the 17th century, you can already begin to see universal histories being written out of Europe, which purport to cover the entire world, you see, right? So I think that a proper assessment of what is really entailed in both the political economy and what one might describe as the political psychology of writing world histories would have to take into account all of these considerations. There are several others as well, but I'm just giving you an idea of what really is at stake over here. And I think that one of the most wonderful things about Nehru's glimpses of world history, going back to that, other than the fact that it is written in extremely elegant English, and I think one of the unfortunate things about the social sciences, you know, history, by the way, is often placed in the social sciences. It's a story I can't get into because there are some universities which place history within the humanities and some which place history within the social sciences. But one doesn't particularly attach much importance, unfortunately, in the profession to the elegance with which one writes. And I think that one of the more interesting and charming things about Nehru's glimpses of world history is the sheer elegance. But of course, the more critical fact is the fact that he refuses to center it. You see, he creates a pluralistic universe through which he actually then assesses what you might call different kinds of communities. I say different kinds of communities because in Asia, nation states were still coming into being. In the case of Europe, we already have largely nation states. Of course, there were still empires at that time as well. The Ottoman Empire had just broken up shortly before that, right? But you had the British Empire. And so he's not dealing only with nation states. What he's dealing with, and this is the other complexity of Nehru's work, is he's dealing with different kinds of political formations when he's writing his world history. Last little footnote is that he's also extremely attentive to philological details. It's really quite astonishing, you know, that whether he's looking at the root of words and trying to understand what these words mean and what they tell us about history. So I don't know if Kanchana, if that speaks to some of the things that you had in mind when you posed the question.
Yeah, I particularly, when you responded just now, what also came up is not just telling the story, but the way one tells a story, because of the emphasis you made on language and philology and so forth. And I think I find that aspect also very interesting because one of the reasons why people find history tedious is maybe because the narratives are not presented very elegantly. So perhaps literature and creativity is very much a part of history writing and history making thing. I was just curious to know, in the light of this, that you have talked about another aspect in your work on the empire of knowledge, culture and plurality in the global economy. You have here again, focused on this whole knowledge production, which is Eurocentric, and how there is a certain violence that is inherent in that. Now, and it's something we take for granted all the time, you know, in the institutions, in the, at least non-Western parts of the world. Now, here you mentioned that there is an element of dissent in breaking away from imperialistic, hegemonic knowledge systems, that in some sense, Gandhi also embodies this, and you term it as the future of dissent, that a kind of breaking away from the centering that Nehru did, which you brought out so lucidly. This has an element of dissent, it would seem. And can you elaborate on the role of dissent in creating knowledge that is egalitarian, inclusive, and so forth?
Well, I'll attempt to do so. I mean, it's a question that is, of course, of seminal importance, and a difficult question to address in the sense that I think that if you look at the course of the last few decades in particular, I think that many practitioners in the academy, practitioners of scholarship in the academy, will view themselves as actually offering very dissenting views. I mean, if you talk to Marxists, you talk to feminists, post-colonial theorists, post-structural theorists, you talk to Lacanians, right? I'm just taking several constituencies, if I may put it this way, all of whom will submit that the kind of work that they're doing is, in fact, work which dissents from the kind of normative scholarship that took place all the way until the 1960s, right? And then beginning in the 1970s, particularly in the 1980s, when, as some of the critics here would say, when some of the French diseases came into the American academy, from their point of view, that's actually when the academic work started getting corrupt. When post-colonial theory, particularly post-structuralism, comes into the arena, whereas the practitioners see these as very liberating. In the case of Indian history, what we would have to obviously look at is subaltern history, because I think it's generally recognized that subaltern history is doubtless the most important contribution that really came out of schools of historiography in India. Before that, what you had was certain well-known strands of liberal historiography, conservative or Tory historiography, and you obviously had certain strands of Indian Marxist historiography, but subaltern history was viewed as being fundamentally different in many ways. Now, I won't get into the politics of subaltern history. This is all by way of a preface of saying that the first thing we have to understand over here, frankly, is what do we really mean when we speak about dissent at all? Because the perspective from which I am writing, I am much less certain that the work that has been done in the course of the last 4 or 5 decades is really what I would describe as dissenting scholarship, right? I'm not saying that it hasn't been extremely useful for me or that I haven't learned from it. I think one learns from all of these schools, but whether it is dissenting or not is, I think, a question that would have to be discussed at some length. So the only way to really answer your question is to really give you my sense of what is critically important for someone like myself when I do the kind of work that I do, right? And whose work really in that sense has been inspirational, let's say, for me, right? So my first submission to you is this, that no matter what discipline one is working within, each discipline creates its own, not simply protocols, I think we all know that. Each discipline creates the categories through which it views the world. And my first submission is, after this, that there is in fact an imperialism of categories. We have to understand what this imperialism of categories is. So if you're an economist, what are the categories that you're interested in? You're interested in, for example, notions of growth, right? The economist who would dare to say that I don't believe in growth would no longer be an economist. That person would be pushed out of the profession, because as an economist, you're supposed to believe in growth. Now, the more progressive economists might not only believe in growth, but might also believe that it is important to achieve both equality and perhaps equity in society, right? Some economists may not be concerned with that at all, because if you're a laissez-faire economist, you might simply say, well, the free market has been shown historically over the course of the last 3 or 4 centuries to be the best economic arrangement devised for man, for human societies. And it will produce certain kinds of outcomes which may be favorable to some, may not be favorable to others, but that's how it is. But everyone has a chance in the free market economy, right? So what is the economist doing? The economist is working with this category called growth. If you are somebody who's thinking about society and development, what are the categories that are unquestionably viewed as productive outcomes? Let's take the idea of literacy. Now, it is very interesting. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, you will find that the word literacy is of relatively recent vintage. It goes back to about a century, a little over a century, as opposed to the word literate, which in fact has been around for a very long period of time, for several centuries, because it would have been quite common to have said that so-and-so was literate. For example, we could say that Milton was, the poet, was a literate person. William Wordsworth was literate. And so was not literate, was illiterate. Okay? Literacy, however, is an evaluative word. It creates a scale. Much in the way in, let's say, in the late 19th century, if you read Joseph Conrad's novel, much heralded novel, still highly celebrated and still widely read, Heart of Darkness. And there he has a passage in the Heart of Darkness where he says that, well, there are people whom we simply evaluate or judge by what their nose looks like. Okay? Right? Because in the late 19th century, physical anthropology became an evaluative scale by which we placed one civilization in relationship to another. Now, what I'm saying to you is this, that literacy is in fact an evaluative scale by which we place one civilization in relationship to another. Right? And therefore, we should understand that literacy is not simply an objective assessment of a society. It is actually an evaluative scale which places a civilization in a hierarchy of civilizations. Right? That's what I'm referring to as the imperialism of categories. What are the categories through which we actually apprehend and understand the world? And one of the reasons why the question of dissent is so pivotal is because in the modern system, the American university being a fantastic illustration of this. In the modern system, we have learned how to package and contain dissent completely. Therefore, the problem that, in a sense, the problem that really we have to think about is how do we speak the language of dissent when dissent, no matter what kind of dissent it is, has already been packaged, contained, and even marketed. Right? And this is really, in a sense, the fundamental problem for people who are interested in what I'm interested in, because history happens to be one of the disciplines in which I work. But I don't have a disciplinary background at all. I mean, many of you will be astonished to know that I don't have a single degree in a discipline. Not a single degree. And I certainly don't have any degree in history at all, even though I teach in a history department. But I earned my bachelor's and master's from something called the Humanities Center, and I earned my doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations. But I wasn't working in a discipline called literature or history or philosophy, anthropology, whatever the case may be. So for me, the question really is a question of when I attempt to understand something, I'm interested, particularly when we're looking at social and political conditions and the arrangements that have been devised by each society, right? To make society, one assumes, a little more harmonious, to introduce methods of governance which are not oppressive. When one looks at these kinds of questions, the fundamental question for us that arises is, what are the conditions under which knowledge can become actually emancipatory for people? And my view of the matter is that this has become increasingly difficult to do it has become increasingly difficult. This is contrary to the common view, which says that, well, we are now armed with a lot more powerful tools for understanding oppression. Right? But what we have to also be aware of is that the processes by which our dissenting thoughts are now contained and packaged and even sold as dissent have become far more sophisticated than they used to be 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Right? And so this is really the, if I may put it this way, the kind of problematic that I want to work with. Let me give you a very different illustration. I have a very close friend in India who is one of the leading human rights activists in the country, widely recognized. I won't mention his name, obviously, for purposes of civility and privacy, but he's one of the leading human rights activists in India. And he has long been interested in questions of the homeless, as he puts it to me. So one day I engaged him in a little conversation a few years ago. I said, you know, I have some reservations about how you use the word homeless. Because, and I explained to him the following. See, I am aware of the fact that there is a large percentage of people in India who do not have a roof over their head. I don't deny that fact. Many of you here who have joined the seminar because it's being hosted from Mumbai know this better than I do. Right? But I've lived for many years in Delhi and lived for several years in other Indian cities put together, and in a number of other developing countries such as Jakarta, Indonesia. I lived in the capital, Jakarta, for 2 years. So I certainly know what it means not to have a roof over your head. But there is a fundamental difference between the homeless in Delhi or Mumbai and the homeless in Los Angeles. And what is that fundamental difference? That when I am in Delhi, even at 11 p.m. at night, and I go by and I see 6 or 7 people huddled together on a street corner, and they're sleeping on the street, they're sleeping even on a cart, for example. What I see is that these people still have a community. When I see the homeless in the US, when I walk out of my home and I walk 3 blocks and go under an underpass, I see a person there utterly alone. It's very clear, in a situation of abysmal despair. The question is, should we just infer that there is one kind of, quote, homelessness as there is one kind of poverty, as many people assume? If there was only one kind of poverty, why is it that Farsi or Persian has 70 words, 70, for poverty? Because it is very important to distinguish between someone who is forced into poverty, someone who embraces poverty. That would be the first fundamental distinction that we would have to actually make. And then we would have to parse each of these into smaller categories, finer categories, right? And what I'm suggesting here is that one of the problems of scholarship, at least for those of us who work on South Asia, who work on Africa, who work on Latin America, who work on colonized societies, formerly colonized societies, is that the template of knowledge produced here is automatically applied to countries like India all the time. So because they're homeless, because this whole category of homeless is a category of that was produced in the wake of industrial society. And the homelessness that was produced as a consequence of industrialization and industrial societies produced a kind of social anomie, which I think is fundamentally different from what it means to not have a roof over your head if you're in India. To say this is not even remotely to minimize the problem of those who don't have a roof over their head in India, but it's to say that we're going to have to think about this very differently, because we are really using the categories that have been produced under certain social conditions. And these categories are then used automatically when we think about India. And I will go so far as to say that this is one of the fundamental issues with doing history itself, actually. Okay, we haven't got into that, but how we do history in India is itself a reflection of the very same kind of problem that I'm talking about.
Thank you, Professor Lal. I was just, as I listened to you, I also wondered about another aspect, that the imperialism in knowledge, that is surely a cause for concern, and you have made us think about this, the way we need to contextualize even empirical notions very carefully and so forth. However, isn't there also a certain power hierarchy within India, let us say? So it's not quite an external imperialism, but also an internal imperialism. What Ambedkar has pointed to, the caste system within India, which has prevented, for example, knowledge dissemination and circulation of underprivileged castes. This is something we don't get in our institutions. This is something that Ganesh Devi has also brought out in his work on education, that there is a need, after all, to listen to people who are not really there with privileges of the city, class, caste, and so forth, gender. And this is something that is quite, this is something that is not quite there in our university system, or even in our college system, which is based on rote learning and so forth. So how would you address that aspect?
Well, I think the question you have posed is not simply very legitimate. It's a vital question, and there are obviously people who have been weighing in on this matter. And of course, I mean, one of the lines of what we might describe as attack in recent years has been to suggest that, look, whatever might be the problems that India has inherited with regards to Western scholarship, that we have indigenous problems of our own making, that there are indigenous forms of hierarchy which have long been present on the Indian scene, and that these would have to be addressed as well. Of course, the question we will have to ask is whether they are being addressed, whether the people who think they're addressing them are actually addressing them in the sense in which, they think they are. That is, that they think that addressing them in the particular manner in which they are doing so produces conditions of emancipation. I think that's a question that we will have to seriously address. So we can take a number of concrete illustrations and see how this might work out. Now, the first question here that you've raised, I mean, and I think you will appreciate the fact that this is obviously a massive array of inquiries would be required to begin to look into the whole question of caste. And I don't think your question so much is, how should we look at caste and all of that, because obviously there is a vast body of work. Much of it, however, I would say is very conventional. There is actually work that is being done on caste, which is very different than the kind of work that has been produced by some Dalit scholars. There is a Japanese scholar that, for example, whom I've been in touch with for quite some time, Akio Tanabe, who has written a fantastic work on Orissa, where he talks about caste as a form of ontological equality, actually. But I'm not even going to bring that into the picture, because that's a very different kind of body of work about what it means to think about the category of caste. Let's look at it this way. Number one, since you had mentioned Ganesh Devi as well, and I think, Kanchana, you're aware of the fact that Ganesh and I and several others have long been involved in a collective called the Backwaters Collective on Metaphysics and Politics, where we're thinking through these kinds of questions. So I'm very much, of course, in touch with Ganesh and aware of the kind of work he's done. But and much of the work that he's done is on language. So now one of the questions that has come up, and I think all of us who are listening in on this are aware of what I'm really speaking about. One of the questions that has come up in very recent years, it's a question that really goes back in a sense to the late 19th century, but it's now surfaced once again in different ways. And that is a question of the status of English. Okay, and what is the role of English in education, particularly in early education? Because I think you're aware of the fact that the Dalit view long has been, or at least some strands of Dalit thinking veer in that, has long been that education in English is critically important because it frees Dalits and all of India of the stranglehold, okay, of the Brahminical elites. That's the view, right? That English is emancipatory because what it does is that if you look at indigenous languages, particularly the languages that are Indo-Aryan, Indo-European languages, these languages, derived from Sanskrit, are deeply embedded in Brahminical ways of thinking. That's the argument. That's the fundamental argument, and that it is similarly impossible to escape, to use my phrase in a different context, it is similarly impossible to escape the imperialism of categories produced by Brahminical thought. And therefore, many Dalit scholars and activists have long argued that it is imperative that India move away from education in Indian languages and English be universalized. Now, I think that this is something that has to be seriously questioned because there is also a large body of work produced in all kinds of places which has talked about the importance of the mother tongue. It has talked about the fact that there are large, and in India, by the way, there are large bodies of knowledge that are no longer really even available to people because there simply aren't people who read these languages and read them, especially from the point of view of a scholar. This is becoming an acute problem. How many people can read Old Kannada, for example? All right, very few now that we're really talking about. And we have to remember that every language, every single language is a window into an entire universe, right? So what happens when we begin to, for example, elevate English? And I think we all know that this is one of the questions that really animated someone like Gandhi, who was, of course, completely fluent in English, but was quite insistent that India needed something like Hindustani, or at least, if you don't want to have one language in the singular, a number of languages, Indian languages, which could be used collectively to forge some kind of notion of the Indian nation. I don't believe that it is possible to forge some kind of notion of the Indian nation through English. I don't believe that that's the case. And I also think that there is a kind of instrumentalization of English in the Dalit worldview, which I'm extremely worried about, much as I'm worried about this kind of instrumentalization when it took place in a country like Malaysia, which I have visited frequently, where Muhammad Mahathir, would say that every Malay needs to know English, right? But for him, English was simply the language of business. It was a language through which you got a job, right? And became part of something called a world citizen, which is a nonsensical term, frankly, right? But they all wanted world citizens who would know English in Malaysia. For him, English was not the language of Shakespeare and Milton and Coleridge and Blake and Wordsworth or Edward Gibbon. It was simply a passport to getting a job, right? To becoming successful, which seems to me to be a very shallow conception of what the good life should be, what a thoughtful life should be. So I've just taken one illustration here, which is the question of language, but we could take other kinds of illustrations to try to understand the problem that you're talking about, because you're saying that, look, there is a long history of oppression in India as well. We have a history of oppression in India of various communities. It's not only obviously Dalits. We would have to think about the Adivasis. We would have to think about what is their place, for example, in the nation. And my submission to you would be that one of the shortcomings that I have seen in the Dalit view is a wholesale, and I would say relatively unthinking adoption of certain ideas from the West, including, for example, what it means to recover a people's history, okay? Because this is fundamentally the project that people have been involved in large parts of the world. People are all trying to recover their history, so to speak, right? And so, for example, if you're in the United States, what has been one of the major impetuses in not only in the academy, but in the larger public sphere? It has been that different immigrant groups, each is trying to say that I want to recover the history of my own group. So if you're at a university like where I am, UCLA, the Korean Americans are fundamentally interested in Korean American history. The Chinese American are interested in Chinese American history. The Indian Americans are interested in Desi history, right? And so on and so forth, right? This is essentially what it becomes. And of course, there are lots of critiques of what this really produces. But let me encapsulate my critique in just a phrase, okay? See, the fundamental impetus behind this is a certain kind of concern with identity. And people are deriving their politics, as the Dalits are, from their identity. In my view, this is short-sighted and not eventually productive in creating an emancipatory world for all of us, because I don't think we should be deriving our politics from our identity. I think we should be deriving our identity from our politics. We first need to understand what our politics will be. And the politics means that we find solidarities, whether it's with Dalits or Brahmins, or men or women, or gays or heterosexuals, or Africans or Americans, whatever the constituencies. We first find solidarities of politics. And that includes the way in which we view the world, the way in which we view bodies of knowledge, right? I am not even remotely suggesting that we should minimize the kinds of hierarchies, the importance of these hierarchies and the sufferings they have imposed on large numbers of people, whether it's in India or in some other place, right? But what I am saying is that, in my view, the way we are trying to unravel these histories is not only not producing emancipatory outcomes, it's actually making things considerably worse. And I think you can see that very clearly. We haven't had any discussion on that yet at all so far in this conversation, but we can see that very clearly in the way in which the history is now being deployed in the public domain widely in India, right? And we can see the extraordinarily detrimental consequences. Of course, it's a risk that has to be undertaken when in some ways something gets democratized. And one of the things that's happened is that there is obviously a greater degree of democratization in a way. I don't know if I would describe social media simply as democratization, because it's not necessarily a thoughtful kind of democratization that's been going on, but everybody is fundamentally now a historian. And we're seeing what the outcomes are in India, which I'm happy to talk about.
I would just like to bring a point in here in the context of this aspect of English and the Dalit appropriation of English. If you go through Ambedkar's extensive body of writings, it's not that he doesn't celebrate English, not as they instrumentalize it. In fact, we see at several points this critique of the university system that is just based on examination, unthinking knowledge, and so forth. English comes in as a way of interrogating and interacting with other languages. English also comes in because there is a whole community that was refused entry into studying Sanskrit. So obviously, where do they turn? You know, so in that sense, it makes a certain dismantling possible. But then that doesn't mean that we fetishize it. And again, how do we reconstruct Western philosophical, political narratives? For example, the French Revolution, ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity says actually lie in the Buddhist notion of Maitri. And it's not really something that is alien to India. So in this sense, Ambedkar himself turns to indigeneity for reconstructing democracy, for instance. And I think one of the biggest achievements is the conversion of masses and masses of people in India to Neo-Buddhism, which has given a certain prospect, a certain confidence for writing, thinking, reading. And so my point actually was that we need to look at the certain complexity between the Western hegemonic languages, concepts, knowledge systems, etc., and India. And how do the internal hegemonies and external hegemonies, what are the tensions, and through these tensions, can we produce a body of work? And I think something like Buddhist reconstruction of freedom, equality, and solidarity that Ambedkar did is one such attempt, I would think. Not instrumentalization that I will get a job, so I'm doing it. By the way, pedagogy for everyone in India is closely, education is closely related to finding jobs and finding a better future. Everyone goes to get an education for that, you know, regardless of where we come from, but regardless of our social group, you know. So I was thinking more along these lines. The possibility of thinking, you know, and maybe Gandhi and Ambedkar are not really that apart when it comes to rethinking our traditions and rethinking our traditions critically. One would have to work with it, of course. Yeah.
I'd like to respond to a couple of things you've said, Kanchana, because there's some things that I'm not sure I'm entirely in agreement with, and whether we are in agreement or not with them, but I think I should be very clear about my position. Number one, I was very careful when I spoke about the Dalit instrumentalization of English. I did not mention Ambedkar. Let us not simply conflate Ambedkar and Dalits. That is to say that when I'm talking about Ambedkar is Ambedkar, and of course he is the recognized intellectual leader of the Dalits, right? No gainsaying that fact. But Ambedkar, obviously there is a certain kind of sophistication, although we will get to that in just a moment, and a certain kind of awareness, which is not necessarily present in much of populist kind of Dalit writing. If you look at, for example, one of the persons who is most, whose work circulate a lot, Kancha Elea Shepherd, he's a very good illustration of the kind of person I'm talking about, who has, I would, if I may put it this way, really a kind of blanket admiration for the English language, its uses, and for what he considers to be the emancipatory role of Western thought, okay? Without any consideration, of course, of the enormous problems, not just in the most reactionary strands of Western thought, but even in liberalism, because liberalism was completely complicit with colonialism. There's a huge body of work that has shown that, right? But I was really referring to to the strand of Dalit writing that you find in India today as at large. Secondly, when it comes to Ambedkar, and I also want to say that I think that there is this quest nowadays to try to find points of convergence between Gandhi and Ambedkar. If there are points of convergence, I think we're going to have to work to find them really clearly. That's my own view, because it's not clear to me that the convergences are more important than the divergences over here. The convergences are a very strange kind, which the Dalits will find some difficulty in agreeing. You know that famous expression by Ambedkar when he had a conversation with Gandhi once, and he said to him, you know, Mahatma Ji, you at least have a home. I don't even have a home. Well, actually, the point of convergence there is that Gandhi was equally homeless. I mean, this was a man who, in no sense of the term, ever really had a home, unless you take it purely in the sense that he thought that because he was a Hindu, so therefore he was with the Hindu majority, and therefore he had a home, which would be, it seems to me, a rather peculiar reading of Gandhi if one wanted to engage in that. That would be one kind of similarity. Another very interesting point of convergence is that after a long quest where Ambedkar is reflecting on the fact that, as he said, I was born a Hindu, I'm not going to die a Hindu. But Ambedkar was very clear that he wanted to be at home in some form of institutionalized religion. He was very clear about that. He took very seriously the whole question of Islam. He took seriously the question of Sikhism. Eventually, as we all know, just months before his death, he converts to Buddhism and leads a large number of Dalits in a mass conversion. All right, but it's an institutional home, because Ambedkar was, in his own way, a profoundly religious man, And there again, you find a point of convergence with Gandhi, a very interesting one, which we'd have to really consider in considerable detail. But let us not be under any illusion that Buddhism is somehow, you know, a more liberatory religion than Hinduism or Christianity or Islam. And whether Ambedkar, and there are two different aspects to that. One being whether Ambedkar was sufficiently critical of Buddhism, early Buddhism, and what it meant and how it operated is a question that requires a lot of investigation. You know, the whole question of, for example, who could join a Buddhist order and what were the restrictions and who was excluded. And these are points of discussion that we'd have to really think about. And the second thing is that if you look at contemporary Buddhism, I mean, let's not forget, okay, that we have a nation state such as Sri Lanka, where there has been enormous violence committed, okay? And on the other hand, we have Myanmar. Myanmar is a Buddhist state. Sri Lanka, if you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Myanmar, in particular Burma, what you really have is violence, really, I would say, by Buddhist monks, okay? And so, you know, whether Ambedkar really had a kind of critical outlook on Buddhism as well is something that I think would require a lot of discussion. And here I'm not even speaking about the fact that there are large elements of Ambedkar's thought which is deeply embedded in some of the worst strands of Western positivism. I can't even get into that because I have also read Ambedkar very closely over the years, and I have found some very troubling aspects there in Ambedkar's work. But again, this is simply by way of saying that, you know, if one is going to invoke Buddhism and Ambedkar and all of that, I think that we would have to be aware of that. Finally, you see, in some sense, when you say that, look, you know, some of the kinds of notions that have been given to us by, you invoke the French Revolution, notions of liberty, equality, fraternity, you know, and that in a sense, this is what really the present strand of Dalit thought would like to do is to make us aware of this and see how we can produce these kinds of outcomes in India. But you know, we have to also look at how extraordinarily anthropocentric a document the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was when that was produced by the French Revolution in 1789. This particular document, I would remind you of that aphorism of Walter Benjamin. And that aphorism is, there is no document of civilization, no great document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism. I think this description aphorism is very apt when we look at the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And here I'm not even produced by the French Revolution, which led to liberty, equality, fraternity. And here I'm not even invoking the very common and obvious rejoinder that man simply meant man, the male of the species, not women. That's obvious. I'm referring to the much more profound problem today, that this kind of document became the charter for the exploitation of nature. It is a purely anthropocentric document which simply assumes that nature is there for the exploitation by humans. Right? So I think that these kinds of documents, which might well be produced by some community that feels itself oppressed, to be charters of freedom, but from the point of view from where I'm looking at it, I am seeing them as doing something else as well. Right? And that's something that I really wanted to add, especially because you had invoked this as a kind of a representative idea that Dalit thinkers and activists are interested in.
No, I was not trying to attribute to you any claim about Ambedkar. I brought in Ambedkar purely in an illustrative way to point out that there is a possibility of engaging critically with Western thought, as well as critiquing Indian thought and reconstructing it. The relationship between Gandhi and Ambedkar, whether they are really allies or not, well, that is again a highly debatable question, as you've said. And I will agree that Ambedkar has been very critical of Gandhi and so forth. But the point I was trying to make is both of them in different ways reconstructed indigeneity, that they didn't wholesale simply pick up a notion from the West. That is all, you know, in different ways, because there is a whole lot of tensions to be negotiated and so forth. That's all I was trying to say. So there is very little time. I think now we are already 1 hour is over, and there are several important questions in the chat box, particularly 2 of them I think we need to discuss, and maybe we should give a chance to the scholars who are writing on the chat box. Professor Umesh Bagade is here to raise the question themselves maybe and engage with Professor Lal. So can we, do we wrap it up in about 5 to 10 minutes and then open it up for discussion? Is that all right?
Whatever you know you'd like to do, I'm happy to go along with whatever you think is appropriate. Yeah.
So I just wanted to take this forward. We'll have a discussion because there are many questions that have come up in the chat box about the categories. Are they axioms, etc.? That's an interesting idea that has come up there. And then again, the notion of contradiction in Marx and Ambedkar again has come up. Then Gandhi's notion of homelessness vis-a-vis Ambedkar's notion of homelessness. These are very important questions, and I think there should be a direct discussion with Professor Lal on this, but let us, in just trying to bring it to a temporary closure, this whole dialogue today. I was just thinking about this idea that you mentioned just now, that history in India has been deployed, to use your term, in ways that are going beyond the institution. And you have written about this in your history of history, that there is this attempt by every ordinary person to claim that he or she is a historian, or he or she knows so much about history. Now, is this, as you said today, this is also a matter of democratizing history, opening it up, and so forth, whereby we get rid of, what Habermas and Gadamer have called the domination of the experts. We always find that there are a few experts that dominate interpretations, knowledge claims, etc. So this opening up, in a way, is getting out of the so-called clutches of the expertise at one level, but then at another level, it is reproducing some set ideas. Some set power structures get reproduced through the so-called processes of history being done by the ordinary person, or the ordinary person thinking of himself or herself as a historian. So do you think of this as a plus and minus, that there is a possibility for this particular phenomenon to move in a constructive direction, or then do you just think of it as a way of something that demolishes all the gains that we've had? And in this context, can you tell us something about the Western context? That is there a similar kind of turn to the ordinary person, or is this peculiar to post-colonial societies? The ordinary person taking up the mantle of history and wanting to say, because you've also mentioned today that there is a certain writing of the nation via history, which is why there is so much of anxiety as well. Thank you.
Okay. So, Kanchana, I think in the question that you, a question and series of observations that you put forward, there are a number of things that are related to each other, but I think that they can be addressed as sort of discrete questions in a way, and then you'll see me link them together. Let me begin with the last observation that you made, and that is the relationship between history and the nation. So I would put forward a proposition of this kind, that when a nation state comes into being, the first and foremost intellectual project it engages in is to craft a history of that nation. So when India became free, committees were appointed to produce official histories of the freedom struggle. By the way, Pakistan did exactly the same thing. Indonesia did the same thing. Every country, particularly when it becomes free, will produce an official narrative, official history. And of course, one of the ways in which nations seek to produce conformity, nation states, I should say, seek to produce conformity, is through history textbooks. Right? And there is a whole question about textbooks, whether of history or anthropology or geography, whatever the case may be. I have a fundamental problem with textbooks, and therefore never use ever any kind of textbook in a course that I teach, because what a textbook does is it takes a huge body of knowledge and it homogenizes it in a form that can be easily consumed. And everyone is supposed to have that same version. So in that sense, the history textbook was doing the same kind of work that the national anthem is doing. homage to the flag, national flag, right? And so on. And this is in part what I mean by the relationship between the history and the nation. This is not the only thing, but this is in part. I'm giving you a little glimpse of what I mean when I really speak about the particular relationship between history and the nation state. Now, India poses a very particular kind of problem. I have to say at the outset that, and I think you may already be familiar with this, because I think you've looked at my history of history, but among people who work in the discipline or profession of history, at least in terms of my profession, I would definitely belong to a minuscule minority of those who take the view, as the English did, but for very different reasons. I take the view that Indians were not attentive to their history. Didn't care much about recording history at all. And that, in fact, India is characterized by actually a certain kind of, what we might call a certain kind of interest in ahistoricity. I will just put aside for a moment the whole question of what a philosophy of forgetting would be like and why forgetting is very important. I will just mention that little passage in that great essay by Ernest Renan, What is a Nation, which he wrote in the 1870s or 1880s, where he goes through this very extraordinary exercise. He says, well, what is a nation? Is a nation a group of people who share the same blood, share the same language, share the same history, etc., etc.? He raises each of these and then he falsifies each of these propositions, says, no, it's not the same. It's not the same language, because there could be 8 different countries and they all speak the same language, and yet then why are they 8 different nations then, right? Etc., etc. And then what he says there is that let us not forget, he says, that the act of forgetting is very critical in the founding of a nation. All right. So I want to leave aside for the moment, because that's a very interesting set of questions which have to do with what I call the ethics and politics of forgetting. Because the modern impulse is all about remembering. It's like this injunction. I get emails from people at the bottom of that. They'll have a little quotation, about the necessity to remember. It's like the necessity to remember the Holocaust, for example, so that we won't repeat it, that kind of thing. All right. Now, in my view, India is very singular. And I will then come to the question with which you started, okay, about the democratization, but I have to go work it this way. India is very singular in that I don't think Indians at all actually cared for what we would call history, okay? And I think that this was the view very much adopted by Gandhi. In that sense, one often wonders what is it that made Gandhi tick with the masses. There are thousands of books written on Gandhi, some of which have attempted to answer that question. And one answer to that question is that in many ways, he was attuned to the sensibility and the mores of the people. A certain kind of ethos that was Indian was very pervasive in his being and in his understanding, right? And which is why he was very clear. And he didn't say this once, he must have said this 100 times. He said, I don't care an iota, I don't care a jot whether the Mahabharata is history or not. If somebody argued that Krishna is a historical character, he says, I couldn't care less. I'm completely indifferent to that. Completely indifferent to that consideration. He was emphatically clear about that. For 40 years, you can see that in his writings. All right. Now, of course, the colonial officials also took that view that Indians were different to their history, but they saw this as a deficit because by then, in the European sensibility was a sensibility which essentially adopted the view that the most eminent mark of rationality of a people is whether they have a sense of history. And that means two things. One is, remember that can mean two things. One is a sense of the past, and one is a sense of the writing of history, the recording of history, right? Okay. And they were very clear that Indians had neither. I wouldn't take that view. I think that we have a sense of the past. There are different ways of thinking about the past, right? History is only one way of thinking about the past, actually, right? But I am very clear that Indians actually, as the colonial officials said, didn't produce historical records for the most part, were completely indifferent to them. And I don't see that as a deficit at all. I see that as an enormous advantage. And it, I think, has a particular relationship with the kind of religion that, quote, Hinduism is. I put it in quotes because, as we know, Hinduism itself is a relatively recent corporate category. That is to say that people thought of themselves as Vaishnavas, as Shaktos, as Tantrics, as Shaivites, and so on, for a very long period of time. They didn't think of themselves as Hindus, right? So my position here is I am coming from that position, that you find a supreme indifference to historical records, and we certainly don't have works of history coming out of, we don't have anyone who can even remotely be viewed as a Thucydides, or as a Roman historian, nothing comparable to that, or anything comparable to the very rich tradition of historiography in ancient China. Nothing of that kind. It is very striking that for certain periods of Indian history, the best sources we have are Chinese travelers. The reverse is not even remotely true. Nobody studies the history of China 400 AD and looks at travelogues or historical records by Indians, right? But if you're looking at the 4th century here in India, right, you're looking at the Gupta period, well, one of the greatest sources is a Chinese traveler, Fahim, right? So this is the sort of scenario that I'm really talking about. Now, one of the things that happened as a consequence of colonialism, and this is where I get to the first part of your question, was this idea that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee raised it in the late 19th century. He said, how can we be a people without a sense of history? There's something wrong. There's something deficient in us. And there's this wonderful passage in one of his works where he says, the Englishman is so conceited because he goes out on a hunt. He tells us about the hunt. He tells us about the fact that when he was on the hunt, he sneezed, that he took out his handkerchief, blew his nose into the handkerchief, and then he put this dirty handkerchief into his pocket. And he says the Englishman tells us about all of that. He thinks that every single act of his is of historical importance. And he says, on the other hand, people like us, we built these fantastic monuments. No one knows anything about them. We don't even know if half of them survive. They're buried deep in some jungle. We don't even know where they are. There's no historical record. Right? So he agonizes over this. And every Indian nationalist, barring Mohandas Gandhi, agonized over this. Why don't we have a sense of history? Now, I'm saying that in the wake of colonialism, this question has come to haunt India with a vengeance. What was the Babri Masjid dispute about after all, right? Because the claim was by the Hindutva people that it is at this particular spot, Ram Janam Sthan, it is at this particular spot that a temple once stood. That temple had been built there because Ram was born at this particular spot at this particular time, and then they give some date, whatever it is, 7000 BCE or whatever it is, right? And then at the orders of the Emperor Babur, this temple was brought down and a mosque was put into its place. And now we have to liberate this place. And of course, the question that arises for someone like me is, since when did we start historicizing our deities? Since when did we start thinking that Ram has to be viewed as a historical person? Right? And this is, by the way, in part, not entirely, this is in part what Professor Romila Thapar and several others meant when they started writing about what they call the Semitization of Hinduism. That was beginning to be seen. Because what is it? Now, if we go back to the beginning of our conversation, it is precisely this imperialism of categories that I was talking about in a different way. That we want to actually, Semitization, what she's talking about, Romila Thapar there and others who have used that term, some have called it the Abramization of Hinduism, right? That the people who are now trying to reshape Hinduism are using the categories of the Abrahamic faiths. That we want to turn our Ram and our Krishna into a historical Jesus, the equivalent of a historical Jesus. And of course, there are nuances. I know that, right? If we spend 2 hours just talking about this, some of these nuances will come out. But I'm giving you the broader picture and broad brush strokes of what is really involved here. And once this trend started, what we are seeing today is precisely this kind of absolute obsession that has been generated in the Indian middle class with this idea that we have to retake our own history now. And I personally think that this is going to take a generation at least to get resolved. This is not something that gets worked out in the matter of 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. Because when one has a sense of a wounded, and of course, this is partly how it's being constructed now. Of course, there is also a complementary trend, which you can see going back to the late 19th century, which involved the resuscitation and revival of real or imagined martial figures of the Indian past. I have just finished a book 2 weeks ago, which I submitted to the publisher, which is really a book on the art of the freedom struggle in India. And one of the things that's most striking is how many prints were produced of Shivaji and Maharana Pratap and Prithviraj Chauhan. These 3 figures. Because these are all these 3 figures are figures from our real or imagined martial past, right? And so to speak directly and finally to the question that you had started off with, which has to do with democratization, right? I'm saying that what we are seeing is this democratization. And I am not one of those, by the way, who comes from the position and says, oh, how dare these people speak about all of that because they don't have the credentials to do it. No, I don't believe in that at all. I don't believe in that. The problem here is a different one. The problem here is that their sense of history is very much based on the idea of an empirical history that we inherited along with colonial rule. It is not an accident that the British were the most empiricists. And as you know, empiricism is one of the most widely recognized strands of what one might describe as the philosophy coming from England, British philosophy, right? And what is not understood among those people who have now taken part in the democratization is there's actually no such thing as facts except the facts which are produced by the historian. Okay? There are thousands of battles that take place. Those are all facts of the past, but they're not historical facts. What does it take to convert a fact of the past into a historical fact? That's where the historian comes in, which immediately entails the work of interpretation. A fact becomes a fact through the work of interpretation. But what we have in India today, and this is, of course, a problem that is common, I would say, to other parts, because that was one smaller part of your question also was, what about trends in the West, where you see the similar problem, but on a much smaller scale. And that is this separation where people think that there's actually facts. The historian simply takes these facts. It's like you go to a grocery store, you buy a bunch of potatoes, and then you figure out how you're going to cook them. And so what the historian is, the facts are there. The historian simply takes the fact. This is the view that people are working with. No, that's not what it means to actually do history. Because the first thing we have to understand there is, number one, that these facts are, as it were, produced by the historian. There are facts of the past, but those facts of the past, very few of them get converted into what we might, or transformed into what we might call historical facts. And the second thing that, of course, I would really want to insist upon is, or at least would urge that we pay attention to, is the dictum that Benedetto Croce, the great Italian philosopher and writer of aesthetics, said when he said that all history, and I'm quoting him, all history is contemporary history, which is to say that we are always viewing this past from the point of view of the present. And so there automatically the work of interpretation will have to take place, is taking place, right? So these are some of the problems entailed in looking at what is happening in India today. What are the kinds of distortions that are taking place, and why is it that there is, which I think you will all agree, whatever your view of how to assess it, that there is an extraordinary kind of, as I'm saying, obsession with the past, with what happened. What did Babur do? What did Prithviraj do? Why is it that we allowed ourselves to be colonized? And of course, what did Gandhi do? Which is one of the reasons why you're having people in India, which is really sickening, frankly, and that's putting it mildly, people who are celebrating the assassin of Gandhi as the true Shaheed of the nation, And this is precisely in consequence of the kinds of developments that I have suggested here. And I think that some among the more astute of them are well aware of Gandhi's position and his complete indifference both to what I'm calling the project of history and his readings of Hinduism, which are really at complete variance with the kinds of readings of Hinduism that are being furnished by the people who embrace Hindu extremism today. But that's kind of putting it in a nutshell, or a little more than a nutshell. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Lal, for this. In a way, you have, as you said, come full circle, because we ended up where we started. We started out by reflecting reflexively on history. And to an extent, we have come back there, but this time from the very, very concrete context of India and the whole problem of democratization. You also brought out how it is so important to underline the notion of interpretation, because there is no history without that. And in this sense, I find this very fascinating, because we read Dilthey, Schleiermacher, Gadamer, and so forth, and there are so many perspectives on interpretation itself. So is interpretation a case of just getting into the shoes of the historical actor, or is it something else that is happening? Is documentation necessarily the central part of history, that we constantly keep interpreting documents all the time? Or is it possible to engage with histories in other ways, where culture, cinema, sport, etc., and you have brought those aspects out in several of your works. So let us open this discussion now to those who have been putting these very interesting questions on the chat, and I would invite them to speak, because I would suggest that you read those. Of course, you would have read, those of you who are here would have read, but read some more of Professor Lal's work on film, for example, on sport, for example, and this would open up so many alternate ways of doing history rather than simply have the anxiety of reproducing, as he puts it, one textbook version. And I would say this about philosophy as well, because in philosophy, we operate with a binary between Western and Indian, and we are not prepared to see the several crevices, several intersections, several ways of interacting, also several absences of interaction, and maybe engaging with those is what would open up these subjects to going beyond the textbook in a way. Yeah. Thank you, Professor Lal, for this very thought-provoking discussion. It sounds like a cliche, thought-provoking, but you went from the abstract to the concrete and made us think about this whole process of writing history, doing history, the practice of history itself, and how this is not a ready-made thing. It requires a great deal of effort, a great deal of reading, a great deal of engaging with controversies, critiques, and so forth. And without that, it can't be sanitized, you know, to use the phrase from that you use from Professor Thapar. So I invite the questions now. S.C. Cruz had a question here, and do we call the axioms do we call these categories that are used, significant categories in disciplines? For example, you had mentioned economics has productivity, philosophy similarly has the growth. I think you spoke about growth in economics. Similarly, philosophy has the notion of reason, for example. Can we think of these as axioms from which the rest of the analysis should follow and under which the work should be judged? This is the question. S.C. Cruz, you could add to this question, maybe?
Yes, hello, good afternoon. It's an honor, Professor, to be in this place. I have been following your work for many years, mostly your lectures in the history of British India. I am from South America, but I live in Hong Kong. I'm a teacher of Spanish, and I also study philosophy. So from this point is that I plotted the question, because I see that when it comes, and this morning I was speaking with my wife about why, or from where comes this word of world history or world literature, which in Spanish, it is the word is used the word universal history and universal literature. And I was thinking that many of these words of universalities, it comes indeed, it's from a Western perspective of seeing the world and imposing the literature on top of many others. So I think that what they have done actually in this imposition is to somehow name or put a name on in the world, on the things that they have been conquering, and that works as a principle from which everything has to be taught from that moment, and everything, I mean, mostly values, and from which perspective it has to be judged, you know, in the further works. So when they come to a place, it's a little bit perhaps epistemologically that they come, they see how they understand, and they put the moral values, the gnosiological values, I mean, how they see the things, and that is the interpretation. And that interpretation must continue in the sense that it will give authority to the historical narration of world history. If it doesn't follow those principles that they imposed, then for them it's not world history. It might be something with less authority maybe, or something with not say full validity. So in that perspective, I think that this category of world history, world literature, it has been imposed. And in my opinion, it's a very Christian way of seeing reality, you know, like a universality. Catholic Church is the universal church, and they tended to produce this kind of universal categories, including human? Because that is what I was talking to my wife. Who describes humanity, or who are allowed, or who has the right to describe what is a human or what is humanity, in order to then describe what is human history, or what is, so we come to the point that there must have been one single category which has been imposed at certain moments, and that is the one that rules, almost like an axiom or as a principle. And also in the linguistic part that you said about the mother language, because I teach Spanish, I see it in Hong Kong. Many of them, the parents send them the kids and they speak in English at home. And they do not have a mother language. I mean, they are Chinese indeed, but they do not have this mother language. And when you try to go deeper into analysis of philosophy or existential analysis, they do not have the term. And when I ask them, how do you say it in your mother language? They don't know, because they have been just studying English and the parents force them to speak English at home. So there is a layer which is missed there, which is the mother language. I have a Spanish as mother language, and I read philosophy and I studied philosophy in Spanish. And when I try to, and I know that when I go to come to English is a different, let's say sometimes semantic. But this mother language, whatever it is, I have seen that it gives indeed a background from which any of us depart. And then comes a different language. And that is something that I have seen also when I teach students, they use as axiom English as a principle. And they cannot grasp other languages because English is just one language with one single history, and they cannot really grasp the rest because they're still using this English as if it is the principle that can explain them all things in the world. It's something that I have seen, and from where I can say that, yes, it was an imposition of one category saying it is like this, or this is the right one. And from there, they start interpreting the rest of things. So can we use these categories that you say as principle or axioms, gnosiological axioms, to interpret the rest of the world, rest of histories, rest of values, cultures, etc., etc.?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting set of reflections that you've actually shared. I don't know that, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about whether one could, for example, I mean, to speak directly just to the question very narrowly, and then I'll broaden it out, my response in a moment. But whether, for example, the question being whether one could use the word axiom instead of categories, because an axiom also suggests a rule. Okay, indeed. A rule. All right, it suggests a rule, as when we say rule of thumb, you know, right? I'm not sure that categories have that notion built in the way in which I'm speaking of categories. So let me use a much looser sense for a moment. I think you'll understand the spirit of my observation. But I mean, I'm intrigued by the question because I'd have to give it a bit more thought, quite candidly. But I'm just replying, you know, off the top of my head. But that loose illustration of what I mean when I speak about categories, it's very simply something like this. My university furnishes them, but I know every university in the US furnishes the same example because I know what American universities are like, several universities. So at UCLA has a huge music program, okay? And they have a department of music, a very distinguished and large department of music. But Indian music is not taught under the music department. It is taught under ethnomusicology, okay? Why is it taught under ethnomusicology? Because there is a supposition, you see, that the music of the West sets the template, and that everything else is a departure. It's like there is, we in the West have science and China has science. Let's not forget Joseph Needham's massive 20-volume work, Science and Civilization in China. The West is aware of that. But the Aboriginals do not have science. They have ethnoscience. You will never see the science that is the Aboriginals had, which was profound. Because how did they actually navigate their way around the world without even a compass very successfully? Peter Worsley has a book called Knowledges in the plural, where he has a long discussion of this, how certain forms of knowledge become dominant. And not simply become dominant, but other forms of knowledge are not even knowledge. They're not even knowledge, you see, right? So this is what I mean in part by the imperialism of categories, okay? And I don't know whether I would want to call it axiom for the reason that I've described. For example, they're axioms of geometry, but those are rules in a way, you see, right?
Yes.
But let me now address something else that I think I want to say at this point, particularly because someone like Professor Mahadevan is far more learned than I am in the history of Western philosophy, far more. And so I would like to see what she thinks about a proposition of this kind. As someone who has long been interested in Western thought, I don't want to at all come across as someone who's arguing against, quote, Western thought per se. I have a problem with the categories that have been produced by the dominant strands of Western thought, unquestionably. But Western thought is not singular. There are dissenting traditions that became recessive in the West itself. And one of the things I have long thought was exceedingly important about Gandhi, and once again, I see him in this sense, you see, as far more interesting than Ambedkar, far more progressive than Ambedkar, in this sense, was that Gandhi understood very well that in some ways one has to think about how one forges alliances with the other West, the West within the West, that became, as it were, recessive, marginal, dissenting. For him, of course, that other West was represented by Tolstoy, represented by Emerson, by Henry David Thoreau. In fact, represented by Jesus. By Jesus. That's one of the reasons he picks up on Tolstoy is because he says that Tolstoy is one of the few writers who has understood that the religion of Jesus and Christianity are two different things. Two entirely different things. He's very clear about that. And he gets this from Tolstoy, particularly from The Kingdom of God is Within You, but from some of Tolstoy's other later writings, which are scattered over a number of different places, you know, where he talks about the development of Christianity and how Christianity completely contradicted the teachings of Jesus and went in a different direction and became concerned with many other things. Of course, you know, Jesus says all kinds of things about, you know, who shall enter the kingdom of heaven? Well, the church was the largest owner of property, as you know, in Europe for centuries. In almost every place in Europe, the church was by far the largest property owner, you know, right? So we can get into those kinds of histories, but that's a different matter. What I'm really trying to suggest here is this, there is an interesting, because you talked about Christianity, and one of the things that is again a problem in Western thought today is this disavowal of the deeply, profoundly Christian roots of even secular thinking in the West. Okay? And we need to do a lot more work on that. I am absolutely, utterly convinced of that. Right? And I think that your comment, in a sense, speaks to that particular proposition, okay, that I'm trying to suggest. So two different things. One has to do with what I'm describing as a deeply, profoundly Christian roots of Western thought, even the secular strands of it, right? And the secularizing strands of it. And secondly, what I'm describing as the question of the other West. Because I think that there is certainly ammunition that one can get from within the Western tradition, but these Western writers who were really at variance, Goethe is a fantastic example, you know, because Goethe is recognized as one of the great figures of Western humanism and all of that. But one of the most interesting books that has ever been done on Goethe has been done by an Indian, by Jeet Singh Oberoi. The book is called Goethe, the Other Mind of Europe, because what he tries to show is that Goethe produced a whole body of work which actually is very much against the kind of work that was produced by people like Newton and Locke, you know? But all of this was marginalized within the Western tradition itself, which tried to promote what you might describe as an official version of Goethe, as was the case with Tolstoy. Because for Europe, the Tolstoy that mattered was the Tolstoy of War and Peace and the great novels, not the Tolstoy who, from their point of view, becomes a raving lunatic, you know, for the last 25 years of his life because he embraced a radical, nonviolent version of Christianity, among other things, you know, right? So these are some of the, I mean, I think I did speak to the question of axiom, but there are a number of other thoughts that came to mind while you were speaking, you know. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's move to the next question by Professor Umesh Bagade, who is one of our very prominent historians who writes in both Marathi and English. Is it not that contradiction is important for forging solidarities? And what's your take on Mao's notion of contradiction? Doesn't Ambedkar give a different account of contradiction? He has another question on Gandhi's homelessness and Ambedkar's homelessness. I invite Professor Bagade. Is he here? He has left. Seems like he has left. Okay. You could still address it and maybe he can see the video for your response.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll respond very briefly. I mean, speaking to the second, because there are two questions. One is the question of contradiction, and the second is the observation about Ambedkar and whether Gandhi's homelessness is metaphoric and Ambedkar's is not a social reality. I don't know that I would necessarily agree with that observation, because I mean, this is apart from the question of whether the metaphoric is of, you know, lesser value, as it were, if one took that view than what purports to be social reality. I mean, let us not forget, particularly, by the way, that in many ways, as the architect of the Indian Constitution, or to put it more accurately, as the chairman of the drafting committee, because he was not the only person who was sometimes it's almost forgotten that there was a whole committee that drafted the Constitution. Ambedkar had a lot to do with the shaping, as he thought, of modern India. And if one takes that into context, we can see to what extent the very India that Gandhi helped to usher into being, at the very moment of birth, that country completely disavowed him. This is what has long been argued by those who understood that the assassination of Gandhi was a permissive assassination. It was allowed to happen. And here I'm not speaking in the usual sense in which history buffs love to talk about conspiracies. You know, I'm not interested at all in conspiracy theories. I'm interested in the question of the fact that there was a large section of the Indian middle class and the elites which had become entirely uncomfortable with Gandhi and were beginning to see him as a great liability, which was precisely the point of view that was being echoed by Nathuram Godse in his defense when he was put on trial for the murder of Gandhi. Right? But, you know, Gandhi is someone who is in a sense, not at home ever. It is not an accident how he lived his life, why he never had the nuclear household, as it were, why he always lived in ashrams, which he created, right? We'd have to really understand the importance of all of that to understand what it means to really speak about the great irony that the man who was the architect of the nation state was the man who most emphatically repudiated the very idea of the nation state. Because Gandhi understood the nation state to be the locus of many of the problems that stem out of modernity, right? So in that sense, if anything, I would say his homelessness was far more acute than the homelessness of Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, right? That would really be a brief response. On the question of contradiction, yes, Mao obviously works with a sense of contradiction, apparent in some of his earliest writings, most beautifully in his report on the condition of the peasants of Hunan, 1928, where you might remember that expression when he is talking about, the revolution that he wants to create and the revolution that the workers are going to create, right? The peasants, I should say, not the workers, because the workers, this is a report on the condition of the peasants. And of course, unlike Marx, who was not really attentive to the question of the peasantry, Mao very much was. And contradiction is the essence of what the revolution seeks to effect. When he says, it's fine, it's terrible. It's fine, it's terrible. Both holds on to that contradiction simultaneously, right? So I think that there are different registers in which one can understand contradiction. And certainly I would agree that contradiction, as has been suggested in this observation here, is important in forging solidarities. That's one of the things that Mao was himself really talking about, right? But since I'm not here to actually, physically engage with my interlocutor here, I don't know how much further I can really elaborate upon some of the ideas unless I get some kind of understanding of what exactly he has in mind. So I will stop, I think, with this observation.
Thank you so much. One point I wish to bring up in response to your earlier discussion with Professor Cruz about engaging with the other West. There is a very big engagement that Ambedkar had with the tradition of pragmatism, which does not have much of a position in Indian academy, and particularly via the figure of John Dewey. And this is a very fascinating point because Scott Stroud, for instance, has been visiting India many times, and he has documented how in Ambedkar's library in Bombay, there is a huge collection of books written by John Dewey and the marginal notes, etc. And the ways in which he reconstructed, he constantly invokes him in the Annihilation of Caste in order to rethink him in other ways. I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
Yes. If I may just add a little bit, you're absolutely right about that, Kanchana, about the importance of Dewey in Ambedkar's thought. But the only thing I really want to add is this, that that in the 1920s and 1930s, at that time, we would not be able to view Dewey in the West as being outside what we would describe as one of the trajectories of mainstream Western thought. That is that, pragmatism had a place in the American intellectual tradition at that time. And Dewey's ideas, yes, there were people who rejected them even at that time. But let's not forget that there are lots of strands of work at that time where Dewey's work was quite acceptable. And William James, of course, we can think of, William James is a little complicated here because, as you know better than I do, since you're a professor of philosophy, that in addition to his place within American pragmatism, he also has work such as The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is written in a very different kind of tenor, right? But all I really want to say is that you're absolutely right that Ambedkar engaged with that. But whether that was an engagement with the other West, that is what I would have some questions on.
I wouldn't never say that pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce, or George Herbert Mead or Dewey, they were ever mainstream, because one of the big problems we deal with is the problem of rationality and scientific methodology, which has been dominated by British empiricism and the kind of thinking that came from the analytic school, even in the 20s and the 30s, so that Dewey was always a marginal figure in Western intellectual history, I think, in that sense. The other point is that is precisely why someone like Richard Rorty years later goes on to appropriate Dewey and reconstruct him as a way of dealing with the whole problem of a methodology in analytic philosophy that emphasizes so much on observation without looking at the context of observation. Maybe his notions on education, they did play a role in the American mainstream. One would have to think with it. Yeah, one would have to think with it very carefully, as you say. Yeah. Let us turn to the next question by Raj Karya, who is a student of, Professor Cruz has written about the Chinese narration of India in the 4th century and sent us the YouTube video link. Thank you for that. We will watch it. Then we have a question from the student of philosophy, Raj Karya, who says, would it be a fair assumption to make that this new obsession with history is linked with a nation freeing itself from the colonial mindset, as you mentioned at the start? Raj, can you simply come in and speak since you are here?
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So at the start of the session, Professor Lal, you mentioned about how it takes generations for a nation to free itself from the sort of colonial mindset or the burden of it. So if we do not take into the past, accounts of why India was ahistorical in the first place, if we do not look at it, and if you look at just this simple new obsession in isolation, would it be fair to say that it is because we are freeing ourselves of that colonial mindset, or that, so to say, the impression that the British left on us, that we are now trying to, define ourselves in a new way? And you mentioned in the second response to the second question that ma'am asked, you mentioned about how your notion of identity, you said that it should be derived from politics. So then in that sense, is this new obsession is also tied in with reconstructing the image of the nation, or the image of the citizen of the nation, the identity of.
Yes. So what I'm saying very briefly is that, see, this enterprise of history writing, using history as a template through which we understand our past, ourselves. See, to some degree, and this is where your question is coming from, so to some degree, it is a kind of a fait accompli. It's inevitable, right? partly because the idea of doing history has become entirely universalized. You know, you take the smallest Aboriginal group. One thing you cannot tell them is you don't have a history. That's one thing you can't tell them. You can tell them anything else, you can't tell them that. Right? And this is partly what I'm talking about, is a kind of hegemony that history has created. I mean, it's not an accident that, you know, in Western countries such as the United States, and I know this is true of UK as well, lived in Britain for 2 years. I mean, you have things like a History Channel, we're very popular. And by the way, 50% of that is all about Hitler. There's some morbid fascination with the final solution and Hitler. I mean, the minute you turn on the History Channel, there's a very good chance there'll be something on Hitler and the, you know, what happened in the 1930s and the final solution and the Holocaust and all of that. Britain has one, Australia has one. They don't have a sociology channel, you know, right? Or a geography channel, really, right? Because history is the preeminent discourse in that sense, right? So that is the backdrop that we're talking about. But what I'm saying is that, in fact, actually the particular manner in which we are now, in the manner in which history is carried out, that is a task of doing history, so to speak. This is not freeing us from the colonial mindset. This is simply actually only reinforcing it. In my view, the modern middle class Hindu understanding of Hinduism is far from giving us some, quote, in pre-colonial conception, and then the Hinduism, it's completely colonial in conception, almost completely, right? So therefore, there cannot be any argument to the effect that this is, you know, this is really freeing ourselves from this colonial mindset. But what I think what Raj, you're suggesting is that, well, you know, if I say that, look, this will take a generation or two to work out, am I not saying that, well, there's no other mode now in which we can address these questions? And unfortunately, you may be right, that is what I might be saying. I do think that it is going to, you know, because look, for those of us who are disturbed, some people may not be, but I'm going to say for some of those of us who are disturbed by the kinds of developments that we're seeing in India today, I won't mention them by name and I won't enumerate them, right? But for those of us who are disturbed by that, my view of the matter is that it is absolutely correct, and it should be done, that human rights activists and dissidents and people who view themselves as liberals should protest, should take umbrage at it. But my view of the matter is that, unfortunately, it will probably take a generation or two for this to unravel. Because I think that there is this deep sense of grievance, enormous sense of grievance, especially that the Hindu middle class has. And I don't believe that this is going to be addressed only by trying to negate it through a discourse of liberalism and human rights and all of that. And this is independent of the question of whether those kinds of discourses are necessarily as emancipatory as they're held out to be. There's a very complicated history to be written of the whole question of human rights. And of course, there are other kinds of critiques which I'm not even entering into, which are the critiques which have pinpointed, as I did, going back to the French Revolution, you know, the fact that many of these documents that have been produced are documents that have shown no kind of planetary awareness at all. And that is one of the things that is, of course, changing, because there is now quite a lot of discussion going on about climate change. And there's actually even very interesting philosophical work on such things as atmospheric justice, for example. Right? So I think that, you know, a proper assessment of this would entail moving into the kinds of considerations that I'm laying out here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that discussion. And I think we'll close with this question, the last question by a professor of philosophy, Professor Sachidanand Singh. He asks in the chat box, and maybe he could come and enlighten us a little on his question. Doesn't history need to be freed from the humanistic categories themselves? I found this question particularly interesting in the light of your point that the French document of the French Revolution itself is so anthropocentric, and the Walter Benjamin point you made that there is so much of violence in the various documents of civilization. So this is perhaps taking this up. And there's one more question which we will address and then we'll close. Professor Singh, can you come and speak very quickly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Vinay Lal. So my question was like, as you have suggested, that how there are facts from past and there is something called historical facts. So the very selection of historical facts is assuming lots of humanism, that something that human can know, and we can talk about human history basically, and it ignored, as the Chakravarti has recently very interestingly pointed out, this fact that how systematically we are getting rid from geological history, and there's a need to bring that along with human. We need to bring non-human and nature. So my point is that, as you pointed, that how Professor Oberoi in his account of that how it's a reformation that drive modernity, not modernity was something called product of science itself. So how does different way to approach at the origin help us to get away from humanistic approach to history, and it help us to incorporate others. So basically history itself is suffering from imperialism of category, and that is humanism.
Well, I mean, I agree with the general tenor of your remarks. I just used momentarily ago, a couple of minutes ago, that phrase planetary awareness. And to speak about a planetary awareness means, to also be aware of the fact that we may have to decenter the human. But I think that it's going to be a very long haul for a profession such as history, or indeed any other, to move away from the human, the interaction of man to man, because that has been the central thrust of the enterprise of what we describe as history and what emerges as the facts, right? So, obviously when we're looking at the Anthropocene, which is the age in which we are now living, right? Because this is the first age in which the imprint of human activity has appreciably altered the planet itself, right? That is what makes us distinct. And its origins really start to go back to the Industrial Revolution, even though it wasn't measured at that time, but it's become very clear that that is when, for example, questions of global warming started to really already, global warming was already starting to go up dramatically with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and has, of course, accelerated greatly in the course of the last several decades. And the most recent report that has been produced, as you know, of the Interplanetary Intergovernmental Climate Change Panel is not very encouraging at all, because it shows very clearly that whatever steps have been taken are woefully inadequate. But the brief answer to your question is that, yes, I mean, I think that, other worlds will have to be incorporated. I mean, and that's one reason why I think that there is now thinkers both in India and elsewhere in the world, and the West certainly. I don't know about China, but I'm assuming that's happening there as well, and Japan and so on, where there's quite a lot of work being done on the animal, the figure of the animal now. How does one think about the animal, right? And so in short, as I said, I would agree with the observations that you have made. As far as Jeet Singh Oberoi's work is concerned, the answer is a very long and complicated one, because apart from his book on Goethe, he's written elsewhere as well on what he views to be the particular location of a certain kind of modernity, and he traces it back to Zwingli. So, there isn't enough time to really get into that. In his interpretation of the Reformation, why he thinks Zwingli is more important than Calvin or Luther and all of that, right? But in short, I agree with what you've said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. The last question, and we need to close because we have to close at 1 p.m. Mumbai time, but it's okay. It's now 10 minutes past time, but we'll end with this question. Mr. Pranav Gulukota has asked about why the modern nation state needs to have a space program. Is this a consequence of historical thinking that tries to transcend the planet? Mr. Gulukota, could you come online on video and just develop that question a little, very quickly,
Sure.
very swiftly?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I unfortunately cannot turn on the video, but this is more of a straight thought related to the question of anthropocentrism and planetary awareness. The fact that every nation state, in order to become developed, feels the need to develop a space program. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that, its relationship to this whole discussion of historical thinking.
Yes, Pranav, I wish I could be optimistic and say that, yes, that, countries have gone into the space program because they've developed a planetary awareness. I mean, that would be like saying that Jeff Bezos, who took was a private space shuttle, that he's kind of interested in planetary awareness. I think what he's interested in is $1 trillion, not planetary awareness. So the answer to the question really is that it's a very interesting question, but I think one would have to think about number one, first and foremost, the frontier, the idea of the frontier. You see what happens, and particularly, by the way, in the West, I mean, of course, in the United States, as you know, there is what's called the Frontier Thesis by Turner, which has been critically important in the shaping of the whole American psyche, right? And the genre of American cinema that more than any other genre bears a hallmark of being American is, of course, the Western, where the idea of the frontier was once again critical. So what I'm submitting here is that I think the way to begin to answer this question would be to look at this idea of the frontier that, you see, when the frontier continues to recede, every frontier you conquer means you have to then create a new frontier, okay, right? And that is partially what, of course, the space program represents for a nation state. I mean, other nation states may be doing it for reasons which may be different, but once the modular form has been created, so to speak, then other nation states will follow that modular form, okay? And the beginning of the space program definitely goes back, obviously, to both the United States and the Soviet Union and the Cold War. All right, and then that's what it really goes back to, where again the idea of the frontier was very important. But again, these are also forms of capital. These are forms of capital. We're all familiar with the idea of cultural capital, but this is a different kind of capital, and what it means to actually, embrace this kind of frontier, this kind of design. I think it has to do, frankly, more with that than with any sort of what we might describe as, progressive conception that, well, this is a form of planetary awareness, or that, we're going to become, as it were, more, we're going to have a richer conception of the human once we know what's out there in space. Yeah.
thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you all the participants for your very important questions. Thank you, Professor Lal, for patiently engaging with me and with everyone else here all morning here and all night, your time. And it has been really productive, and I look forward to reading more of your work in the context of some of the questions that have come up today. Thank you so much. Many thanks to the Heras Institute and Professor John Dewey for this opportunity.
I wish to thank all of you, Professor Vinay Lal, Professor Kanchana, for your very interesting and valuable, insights you have provided in this conversation. It has really been very enlightening in, to use your own words, doing history. And you see the participation and involvement of the audience has added, you know, I should say, luster to your conversation. Thank you very much for spending much of your valuable time to give us such a wonderful insight into the writing of history or historiography. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much from my side to all of you, all the participants, people who came in to the conversation. My thanks to Dr. John Dewey, to my friend Kanchana, and to Professor Ganachari as well. He had communicated with me as well. So thank you to all of you, and to the Xavier College and the Heras Institute for inviting me to take part in this series of conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Kanchana, I might just say as a little footnote that somehow the recording at this end, I didn't